Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name's Andrew McDonald, and I'll be your host for today's session of Texts in the City, the series where we take books, plays, films from the BCE English syllabus, and we take them out of the school grounds, past the milk bar, maybe grab a soft drink on the way, and then take them to the Wheeler Centre, soft drink and books as well, which reminds me, no soft drink in the Wheeler Centre. But you can have your copy of Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire, which is the amazing text that we're going to look at today. Van Batten was going to be here to talk about this wonderful play with us. She has unfortunately not been able to make it, but filling in at the last minute, and please give him loud applause when we do introduce him, is Josh Nelson. Josh is here. He's an academic, a film critic, a filmmaker. He presents a weekly film criticism podcast for Triple R called Plato's Cave, and he's on ABC 774 every Friday afternoon with Raphael Epstein, talking all things films on the Friday Film Club. So please make Josh very welcome.
Thank you.
So, A Streetcar Named Desire, there is so much to talk about in this kind of classic American piece of literature of the stage. But let's start with where you started with it. I believe that you studied it back at high school. What was your first impression of the book, of the play? The play,
yes. And if I do say film at various points, you'll have to forgive me. I do come from mainly a cinema background, so I occasionally will mix them up. Look, we did study it. I think we studied it in Year 11 literature, and I've actually dug out my old copy with my scrawled handwritten notes, which are very old and not all that intelligent now when I look back and go, I really didn't have a clue.
C minus, like marking yourself.
I'd be lucky to get that now, I think, if I was marking the work. But one of the things I think fascinating between what I thought then and then revisiting the play and also watching and teaching the film is the way I think my allegiances or my identifications have shifted. I think very much when I was reading this and studying this as a 15, 16-year-old male, I think that the lure of the Stanley Kowalski alpha male pseudo-hero archetypal kind of, particularly with the Marlon Brando sort of association, it's kind of is charismatic, and it's scary when you look back and think how kind of charismatic he is and how some people can be blinded by that animal magnetism that he has and his character has.
So you identified with that as a teenager?
I think I did identify more with Stanley, which I am almost ashamed to say, given he's a rapist and a horrible person when you look back. But
who's read it? There's a minor spoiler just there. Who hasn't read it? Yep. So everyone's pretty familiar. Okay. All right, good.
I forgot to do the spoiler alert fingers. But one of the things I actually find disturbing now, and having taught this recently, particularly the film version, and asking students, what do they think and how do they respond to various characters, and I don't want to generalise, but it is more males who respond this way, who say things like Blanche gets what she deserved. She's a horrible character. She interferes in their lives. She's an annoying presence. She disrupts. She just comes in out of nowhere and thinks she can rule the roost. And I find that response quite disturbing in many ways, given what Stanley Kowalski really is.
Yeah, it's such a kind of grey area play. Like, I think it's kind of astounding if anyone can have a really kind of absolutionist kind of opinion about any of the characters or any of the kind of the ways that they behave. So I guess let's kind of talk about the two main characters that kind of do kind of like they are the play. Of course, Blanche Dubois, who must be said like that, Blanche Dubois, and Stanley.
Well, she would say it like that too.
She would say it like that as well. Let's talk about those two characters. They are the play. They revolve around each other. Stella, Stanley's wife, is pretty much just a battleground for their kind of dynamic to play out on top of. How are the themes, the main kind of themes of the gender and class, kind of played out between Stanley and Blanche?
Well, I think they're really interesting characters in terms of looking at them in terms of the various themes that the play/film deals with. Because of that, the way they seem to represent those binary opposites, the opposing extremes. So in the context of gender, of that alpha male masculinity, that hyper masculinity, or that femininity, that airs and graces, the very feminine sort of sensuality that Blanche has. But you could look at them in terms of the other themes that the play deals with: class, and the very much the urban working class embodied by Stanley, and the old South, the sort of the southern aristocracy that sort of Blanche embodies, and also things like the way the text deals with the past and present. that Stanley is very much, and we'll talk about more of these in greater depth, but just to kind of give you an overview, I think for students looking for a way into the themes, that these two characters are really interesting to look at in terms of the way in which they symbolise or embody these extremes of the various themes and ideas that the play deals with.
Yeah, we were talking just before about like the historical context of this play. So it's kind of the middle of the 20th century. America's just kind of won the war for the Allies. They're kind of the new big powerhouse on the block, and that very much is Stanley, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He embodies, well, firstly the sense of America's newfound spirit and power. And you're looking at this play in the context of late 1940s, early 1950s America. They've become the world superpower, in terms of that post-World War II politics. Europe's been decimated, Japan's been decimated. They haven't really had to fight a war on their own turf. Economically, they're in the up. So, he embodies that spirit, that brazen kind of characteristic of America at that time, and he exists in the present. If you look at his character and his impulses and the way in which he responds to various characters and events in the play, everything's in the now. I'm hungry, I want food, eat. The way he stuffs down his food at the table. If he wants pleasure, he'll take it from Stella, he'll grab her, and so on. His reaction to violence, everything. There's no sort of second thought. There's no sense of strategy or of him thinking things through. And we also don't get a sense really from the play, I don't think, of Stanley having a past. He's very much a character who just exists in the now. We get a brief, the references to him having been in the war and so on, which again makes that sort of link stronger. But he does seem to be someone who really exists in the here and now, whereas Blanche is the opposite. She embodies everything about the past, America's past, the deep South, the kind of that fading aristocracy, the references to Belle Reve, and this is a lifestyle that's in decay. The South is kind of gone now. It's a thing of America's past. And
she's the complete opposite to Stanley in the respect that when it starts, you feel like you're getting the start of Stanley's story, whereas she kind of gets there and it kind of takes the entire play for like all the baggage, all of her history to really come out until we find out what's really been going on with her this whole time.
Well, yeah. She's a character who is haunted by her past. She's stuck really in her past, and the play deals with this on a number of sort of different levels, and we can talk about music and so on later. But this recurrence of the waltz that haunts her, like the story of the lover and that history that the audience only gets, like you said, in bits and pieces. But really, Blanche doesn't seem to ever be able to move on, and this is, I think, one of the tragedies of her character, that she's denied a future because of the past keeps dragging her back in, or people discover the past and that becomes a tool that they wield against her.
Yeah, and there's things that she just doesn't, she thinks are a lot more important in terms of values than other things, and she makes it pretty clear that the deceit is like, some deceit is all right and some lies are okay, as long as and there's that line about her which she brings up a number of times where she says, the kindness of strangers is what really matters, as long as we're kind of civil and we're nice and we can be kind to each other, and that kind of, she's talking about strangers in terms of that kindness, but she's really talking about herself.
I think you're right, and I think Blanche is about empathy, and maybe this is what 16-year-old Josh didn't kind of understand when he read the play for the first time. He gets caught up in the Stanley charisma. I think the play is really making us feel our empathy for this character who really just wants to be loved. She wants a way out. She wants to have a kind of a love that's reciprocated as well, and not have this past impinge on that or kind of destroy the potential for her future.
Yeah. So it's called A Streetcar Named Desire. The streetcar is there, obviously. That's a kind of obvious, kind of symbolic. I mean, she takes the streetcar called Desire to where the play takes place, to the apartment. But let's talk about desire, because it's quite obviously a huge part of Blanche's personality. She pretty much it's the only way that she can kind of access any kind of power is by kind of tapping into the desires that she kind of like wants people to have about her. And her whole character is kind of built on that idea.
Yeah, she really represents desire. I mean, the thing I love about the structure of this play, and the film replicates that as well, is we get that line early on about, I need to take a streetcar named Desire, transfer to one called Cemeteries, and then take it, I think, 6 blocks to Elysian Fields. So we get, desire, sex, death, lust, to death, and then the afterlife in Elysian Fields. So Tennessee Williams is basically giving us the kind of structure of her character. But one of the things I find is often not discussed in relation to this text is, what is it about desire? What is the nature of desire? Or what actually is desire? Because I think there's a tendency to just say desire equals sex, or desire equals love or lust. But I think there's a far more sophisticated understanding of desire that this play seems to really represent or tap into. And that is, desire is a kind of a repetition. It's a search for an impossible object or something that might complete a character, that give them a sense of self that they've lost. And I don't want to go on too much of a psychoanalytic tangent and start talking about fantasy here, but there's definitely a fantasy element to desire. When I'm trying to explain this concept to students, I normally give a kind of a fairly banal example about, the friend who has the pursuit of a love object, or we have the flirting stage, and then that hot stage of a relationship where you're just kind of pursuing someone, and then if a relationship might be consummated, suddenly they lose all interest and they're out for the next one. So what their desire has not been the attaining of the object. It's about keeping it at an arm's distance, pursuing it. So this is this idea of desire, that it's something that can never actually be satiated. It can only kind of repeat, in a sense. And for Blanche, I think it's the loss of that lover, that relationship in the past that ended in tragedy, that wasn't the ideal kind of heterosexual pairing that she had built it up to be, and that she's just been searching one love object, one partner after another, to try and reclaim this relationship, which is a fantasy in itself. And this is the tragedy. So the fact that a lot of the events in Streetcar Named Desire and the way in which characters react are founded on repetition. So we have the repetition of her past, just circling round again from one man to another.
Shep Huntley, the wealthy kind of older man, comes up a number of times.
And this is the thing. I think Shep Huntley represents that fantasy object of her desire, the perfect love person who will make her feel whole again.
Do you think he even exists?
I think it's almost better to think of it as a fantasy. I think, but not even just with her character, because we have other characters. We have the repetition. We have Stanley's behaviour towards Stella, this repetition of the violence, the domestic abuse. And you could say that for him, that his behaviour is about the fantasy of his omnipotence, of his masculinity, that he has to kind of keep replaying this ideal image of manhood that he's trying to live up to through this behaviour. And the same thing with Stella, the repetition, and the fact that we have the streetcar, which keeps just clickety-clack along those tracks through the entire play. It's desire. So literally, desire is circling through the entire kind of events of the narrative. Yeah,
let's look at a couple of those characters that you just mentioned there, in terms of the power that they have, or as is more common in this play, the powerlessness that they have. And I guess Blanche is obvious. I mean, she's got her sex, and she's going to use her sex, and that seems to be the only way that she knows how to harness any kind of power. And you can see that she does kind of utilise it with her relations with Mitch. Somewhat, to a degree, and then of course Stanley with he's quite obviously he's got violence and intimidation behind him. They're the kind of things that, and he's kind of his physicality, which is a way for him to get power. What about the characters of Stella and Mitch though? They're a little more ambiguous in terms of how they strive for power and how they achieve it.
I think one of the interesting things about the Mitch Blanche relationship gets back to this idea of fantasy, and that I think each is holding out the other as the hope that they will fulfil the other's fantasy. That for Blanche, it's about is Mitch the last hope for her of being rescued? You
do get an awful feeling right from the start of their relationship that she's settling.
Definitely. I mean, this is the thing. I think she knows it's her last hope, is even just to escape the apartment that in Elysian Fields. And I think for Mitch, it's the same thing. This relationship which he clearly has with his mother, and this sense that he's not the alpha male within the pack of the men. He's looking for some kind of an alternative life, and that maybe she represents this this, for this aging, man, a way out or a possibility of romance or love that he doesn't have. So there is a kind of a strange double reliance, but each is looking up and down to the other at the same time. And I think that it's fascinating to look at the way that relationship, the ebbs and flows of that, the power relationship between those as the narrative plays on.
And at the very end, after everything's gone down, Mitch realizes how he's kind of Stanley has manipulated him and how he's been powerless the whole time. And he kind of rejects Stanley in the end when he's crying on the table, and he realizes kind of that he's kind of trusted Stanley too much.
This is the tragedy of Mitch. All the people that he's sort of looked up to or has held out hope for a future, whether it's Blanche or whether it's Stanley and the other kind of men, one by one he's kind of left completely broken. And this is the sort of the tragedy of his character.
He might be broken, but at least he knows by the end. At least he's kind of developed somewhat. Whereas the character of Stella, if we can talk about her quickly, I feel like she's a character who gets very little development, and I guess that's the whole point, is that Blanche is the woman who's going to push back against Stanley, and Stella is the woman who is not. And look what happens to Blanche, and look what happens to Stella. Well, nothing happens to Stella, but that's the point.
Well, she's still left in that battleground in the middle, and again, it's the fantasy or the rupture of that fantasy for her at the end is this question about the ending, or will she stay or will she won't? Is she going to ignore the fact that she's conscious of the rape? And she even says that if it was true, I couldn't go on living with Stanley, or words to that effect. So again, she's still she's the battleground, but she's trying to negotiate the reality of the social situation, of trying to negotiate the calmness or the mediator between Blanche and Stanley, between both their fantasies and between the reality. So in many ways, she represents that middle ground.
Yeah, and when I talk about Stella, I'm talking about the Stella of the play as well, because in the film the ending is different, of course, and she also, like Mitch, rejects Stanley and says, "No, I'm going upstairs. This is I can't believe it," which changes her character completely, and I think and apparently Tennessee Williams kind of hated that ending. Yeah,
he was quite upset at the fact that at the end of the film, Stella takes the baby and goes upstairs to Eunice's and makes comments like, "I'm never coming back," or it's over. Even then, and I probably disagree with Williams. I actually still think there's a degree of ambiguity there, just because we've seen and we are aware of her behaviour in the past, that she's been up to Eunice's before. She goes up to Eunice's apartment, when she's hit by Stanley earlier in the play, but she comes down again eventually when things have cooled off. So yes, it seems more definitive this time that she's not coming back, but I think there's still room for ambiguity in there. One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the Mitch-Blanche relationship, which the play and the film both play off, is the fact their fantasies can't really be reconciled. And this is one of the reasons I think the audience is aware that this relationship is never going to work out. There's the scene where Blanche puts on the radio, and in the film it's even more awkward because she's dancing and then Mitch starts to try and dance and he's kind of almost doing like 1950s robot, and it doesn't work, and you can tell that he's trying to insert himself into her fantasy of the Vienna, of the dreamlike music, and it's not working. And we see this time and again, like when she says, "This is the French restaurant, let's be bohemian," and she speaks French and says, "Do you speak French?" And he says, "No." And again, she's trying to repeatedly construct fantasies that he can't be a part of. Their fantasy is not one and the same, and that's part of the reason why they can't, I don't think they can be sort of together.
Yeah, and that scene is really interesting in that it taps into the kind of the physicality of the play. One of the things that kind of strikes me whenever I read this play is how beautiful and lyrical the kind of play is. It reads like a novel. The dialogue is just wonderful, and yet each character has its own kind of distinct voice. But there's also this kind of tremendous physicality about the thing, and I'm not just talking about the violence of Stanley, but he often has his shirt off, and there's that kind of that thin kind of piece of material hanging between the two bedrooms in the apartment, and the sounds that kind of constantly pervade where they're living, the New Orleans music, like there's no privacy for them.
Absolutely, and this is again, I think Tennessee Williams' way of suggesting to the audience or to the reader that Blanche can't escape. She has, in this foreign city of New Orleans, she has no way of hiding out because, like you said, there's only that thin divide between her and Stella and Stanley's room. There's no real escape from the outside world. The noises of the street vendors, of the people calling out like hot red and flowers for the dead, and so on. The noise that the city is always kind of filtrating through. There is a sense that there's nowhere that she can hide. So later in the play, when she says it's a trap, or I've been trapped, it's like, well, yes, you've been trapped all along. There hasn't been an escape for you. But the stage description as well, I think it's really worth not just kind of looking at the dialogue in isolation, but Williams' stage directions have a kind of a symbolism in there as well that's really quite rich and I think unusual. I mean, I don't often get that sense when I'm reading plays that you get one of them that struck me when I was flicking through earlier was the blue piano that breaks or has a hectic breakdown, and clearly it's sort of externalizing what's going on inside of Blanche, but it's also preempting the fact that she is going to have this hectic breakdown. I think it's no coincidence the choice of words that he uses in those phrases.
Yeah, totally. I agree. It was all good stuff. When students are studying this, would you advise them to look at the play in terms of theme, or would you kind of give them another starting point in which to kind of break down the play and write their essays and kind of analyse things from there?
Look, I don't think there's any one golden approach. I think, firstly, familiarity with the play. I say this is applicable for film and for plays. If the students aren't familiar with the plays, then don't expect to do all that well, particularly in exam conditions where you're going to be expected to draw on examples from the dialogue or the direction or the structure of the play. So I think that familiarity, the sense of the language, I think teasing out the various symbols, the recurring motifs, I think that's often I find that a useful way to get students into the kind of the approach that Williams has taken, whether it's the use of music or use of flowers or these other sort of motifs, and also characters. What is the trajectory of certain characters? How are they in the beginning? What do we understand of them? How does our understanding or our identification with characters change over the course of the play? And themes as well. I mean, it's sort of you really can't sort of separate them in many sense when you're kind of teaching it, because inevitably they'll come back in a discussion of symbolism or of language and so on. But yeah, I think it's about getting students kind of throwing them in the deep end, getting them to kind of see what strikes them or what are the imagery that they have an attachment to, an identification with, and then sort of run with that, I think. Yeah,
it's it's such a shocking play that I think everyone has, different reactions to it, and it's usually probably a good idea to kind of go with your instinct and grab onto the kind of the thing that seems the kind of like the strongest to you and kind of go from there. We are going to take a few questions from the audience very soon, so if you have questions that you'd like to ask Josh, store them up in your head. We're going to get them to them really soon. I did want to just kind of briefly touch on the very end of the play and what happens to Blanche, and is she insane? Is she mad? And is it kind of a justified madness?
Well, I actually heard someone talking about this in the sense that it's an empathetic madness, that for her it's almost better that she's retreated into the fantasy world, because the reality of what's actually happening to her, being dragged off into the institution, is actually too painful, and that she's a character who doesn't deserve that, which is it's that kind of paradox. It's the paradox that plays out at the end of Shutter Island. If anyone's seen the Martin Scorsese film, when I'm not going to end the film, I'm going to give a spoiler away there, I had to stop myself, but it's the same kind of dilemma of choosing the fantasy or the reality, and which would you choose if you had an awareness. But again, to come back to that theme of fantasy, she or Williams imposes the fantasy of the ideal suitor, but turns it into a kind of a derangement of the fantasy by having it being the doctor and her being wheeled off to an institution, as opposed to her cruise, her ideal cruise with Shep Huntley.
Yeah, and it's just so heartbreaking that that's the way they actually get her out of the place, is not through force, but by kind of almost tricking her into being accompanied in a man and wife type scenario out of there.
The irony is also that as she's succumbing to the fantasy is being stripped away for the other characters. So, like you mentioned before with Mitch, and he attacks Stanley, you know, almost feebly in a sense, and says, "This is all your fault," and then burst out sobbing. And again, the same thing with Stella's character, when you get the sense, the realisation of what Stanley has done to her sister and may have been doing all along. Again, those fantasies are being broken as this other one, this almost inverse fantasy is being, you know, built up in its place.
Yeah. All right, that seems like a good enough time as any to kind of break into Q&A. There's a lot we could talk about, I'm sure.
This is quite a dense play, isn't it?
It is. Who would like to ask a question or make a statement about the play? A question down there. Yep.
So just wondering, like you said that she didn't really like deserve like her fate and stuff like that. Like, what kind of justifications do you have that? Because I'm like, as you said, like a lot of people would believe that she did deserve it. So like, how could you justify it either way? And like, from what you've seen, what's the more popular verdict?
Well, I think, considering her tragedy and the fact she's a rape victim, I don't think anyone could logistically sustain an argument that she deserves to be raped. I find that quite a frightening hypothesis. But I think we need to understand too. I think too often there's a sense of judgment that gets imposed on Blanche. So there's a tendency to say, well, she's an alcoholic. Well, yeah, she has obviously she has a problem with alcohol, but what's behind that? Because you could make the same claim about Stanley. We see him drinking the whole play as well, but we're not so quick to judge him an alcoholic. And this is where we get into that gender territory and the gender division and divide. Same thing with a fantasy with Blanche. People say, oh, well, she's in her fantasy land. Stanley's all about reality. But in that final scene, or the penultimate scene, when she's all dressed up and she's almost succumbed to the Shep Huntley fantasy that she's telling Stanley. Well, he buys into a fantasy as well when he puts on his silk pajamas that I wore on my wedding night. He's performing a kind of fantasy of omnipotent masculinity, of the alpha male. So again, he's not just kind of the real guy. So it's a kind of combatant or a combat of fantasies. In terms of, just to kind of get back to the question of how do we read her, I think it's a tragedy, and I think it's a tragedy for most of the characters. I don't think there's anyone who comes out kind of scot-free or clean in this. And I think it'd be wrong not to have any empathy with Stanley. And I'm not trying to sort of play devil's advocate and say let's feel sorry for the rapist or for the bastard male, but I think you need to look at him and his upbringing as well. If we're going to apply the same thing to Blanche and her past, then this is a guy who's potentially gone through the war. He may have seen horrors. He's definitely had it rough in terms of his class upbringing. He's a person who's had to fend for himself on the streets, very much a man of the streets. There's references to New Orleans as like a jungle, and these references to him as an ape, or and so on. So again, I think it's the key to analysing these characters and how we're supposed to feel about them at the end it requires that extra kind of consideration, or that extra step of what has led to them as subjects or as identities. And again, that is something that VC are playing on in terms of whose reality and how is that reality or that subjectivity constituted or established.
Okay, question in the middle.
Why do you think that Blanche had such a lack of insight into what she was doing to herself? Why wasn't she sort of able to resist what was happening?
I think it was the lure of the fantasy for her, is that there's a double awareness for her, that on the one hand, I think she is aware of what Stanley is trying to do to her and probably will do to her. And I'm not just talking about the end, but in terms of the whole trajectory of the play. But she doesn't want to believe that, because she wants to believe in the fantasy of the perfect relationship and the perfect escape, or the perfect end as well. So I think she's torn between those two realizations. So I think in a sense that prevents her, that refusing to give up on that object of desire, if you want to get back to this metaphor, is what it ultimately kind of traps her. It prevents her from actually moving on, because she's not willing to say it is just a fantasy. It's not real. It can't be accomplished. It can't be achieved. She still wants to believe in the Shep Huntley. She still wants to pursue it.
Because it's hard to believe that she's never met anyone like Stanley before. I mean, that he's not such a unique character that she would have just not known what that was.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, more questions?
Throughout the session today, you keep referring that Blanche got raped and Stanley was the rapist. But in the play, when I first read it myself, I didn't interpret it that way. Isn't it just an interpretation then? And isn't the film also just an interpretation? It's not really a fact. Like when I read it, Stan goes, "We've had this date with each other from the very beginning, and at the beginning she was flirting with him, getting him to button her up, and maybe it's just a flirtatious way." And when Sally goes, "You want to play roughhouse?" I didn't feel like it was a rape scene until when I got to school and my teacher was like, "Then she got raped." So I was like, "Really?"
Okay, I think you, in one sense you're right, and I'm drawing out a reading which I think you could potentially argue against because it's not concrete, because it's not visible to an audience on stage or on screen. I think it's fair enough to say that something serious has happened between scene 10 and 11, between the end of that, like the scene you quoted about, we've had this date from the beginning. And the imagery or the direction that Williams gives of he carries her limp body to the bed is quite loaded, I think. And you also need to consider this in the context of 1948 or 49 when the text was written, and then 51 when the film was produced, that, under the Hays Code, cinema had certain restrictions, so you couldn't actually show certain things. So then you could sort of argue if A Streetcar Named Desire was written now or was produced now, would the rape, the inferred rape, potentially be literalised on screen or on stage? So yes, in one sense, I think you can say maybe it wasn't absolutely a rape because we don't see it, but I think the inference is something serious of that magnitude has happened just from the way in which the final scene plays out.
Yeah, and there's also a reference kind of after the cut from the end of that scene in Blanche having told Stella everything that's happened, and Stella kind of having a fantasy of her own where she doesn't buy into it and that she has to believe her husband. But I think that it would be strange to kind of consider this play without. I mean, there's apart from the rape at the end, there really isn't any sexual violence in there, but the whole thing is about sexual violence, and I think that is the interpretation that you need to land on.
I think part of the reason why Stanley responds the way he does to Blanche's character is because of her sexuality, because he sees her as an independent woman to a certain degree, that she's had this sexual past, that she's in a sense in control of her sexuality. She's not, she hasn't been married off, hasn't been made subservient to patriarchy. So, for him, I think the threat that she poses is specifically on that level of the sexual, and in the end he conquers her physically and also psychologically. Like, he has to destroy her on both levels. It's strange the way the film treats that ending, and there's been references to mirrors throughout the film. We see Blanche looking at herself in mirrors and other characters in mirrors, and we get the sense of this duality of identity, of the ideal image or the image that she wants to see and maybe the reality. And the way they represent this event or this act in the end is the smashing of the mirror. So we get Blanche's image, only the reflection, and then that breaking. So we have the sense of there being no Blanche, that we only see the reflection, it's been broken. So she ceases to exist, in a sense, in the end. And what's interesting in the very final scene is the mirror has been replaced and a new one's been put there. And despite the fact that Blanche is walking around her room, we never see her reflection. It's almost like now she's gone. That ideal Blanche is gone, and there's only the hollow shell of what used to be.
The whole thing was really quite prophetic when you think about the fact that it was, America fighting America, and, they were the heroes of the day, but, that things would just become one side versus the other, and that the American state would kind of gradually decline and decline. More questions? One up there and then up the very back, I think.
Sorry, just building on your the trajectory of characters, would you say a little bit more about Stella, in so much as that she was the sister who chose to cut the past? And what did that do to her in practically denying that she had a past? Because both sisters didn't finish up happy. both sisters' lives were distorted as a consequence of one living in the past and the other choosing to deny the past.
I think that's a really good point. And I often find Stella a more difficult character to engage with because of that she does seem stuck in the middle. But, you know, if we take the idea that Blanche is caught with the past because she stayed behind and, you know, of all the things that have transpired, even for Stella, like you said, she can't escape the past. And in fact, Blanche doesn't really want her to. The layers of guilt that she gives of, you know, I stayed behind, I was there, you were only there for the funerals and the flowers, you didn't see everything else was going on. Where I think that idea is interesting in a gender context is a line that Blanche says when she's talking about the heritage of the fathers and their fathers' fathers, and they withered away Belrive through their own debauchery. And I think that's really key, that we get that gender context for these two women, that this is sort of the ancestral line of damaging men, and look at the consequences for these two women. And, you know, in a sense, Stella has substituted one sort of, you know, destructive patriarchal context for another with Stanley.
It's interesting, especially at the very start of the play, when you get kind of the most kind of, you know, back and forth between the two female characters, and you can kind of see how their relationship has been in the past, that, you know, Stella might have the power to leave the family or to, you know, do things her own way, but Blanche does have the power to manipulate her and to get her to get lemonades and... yeah.
Well, Blanche's use of language too, it's interesting. She wields her language as a sort of a powerful tool, and the fact that we know she's an English teacher and she tries to use word plays and that playing up the class language distinction to wield her, I guess, her imagined power, her power over other characters. But Stanley doesn't buy it. He doesn't buy into the language. For him, it's all again that, you know, like kind of one sentence grunts. We don't really have too many Stanley monologues or eloquence. It's not that kind of character. So he denies her power in that scenario as well.
Yeah. Question up the very back, I think. Or one there first. Yep.
Do you think Stanley actually loved Stella, or do you think it was just attraction?
Well, we could get on a philosophical question of what is love. I think that's a good question. I think in some ways he's reliant on Stella. I think I get the sense that he needs her, and that emotional outpouring, you know, that famous, which is impossible to think of now without thinking of Marlon Brando, I think.
Feel free to scream Stella.
I was tempted, but I'm not going to. And I didn't bring my white T-shirt to tear at the same time. That emotional outpouring where he becomes almost like a child. I think he sees Stella in many ways as a maternal figure. And he's a boy. The way he responds, I get the sense that Stanley hasn't really matured. In many ways, he is still a boy. You know, the way he responds to scenarios. He doesn't think things through. He lacks maturity in a number of areas. So, yes, I think it's love. And obviously, it's lust as well, and I think that's a mutual attraction.
He loves to have Stella, perhaps.
Well, she's definitely an object, and he calls her a baby doll at one point. You know, so he even objectifies her in the language or the kind of the cutesy kind of colloquialisms that they have for each other. So yeah, I think there's a dependency there as well, and so you could argue that if she does leave him at the end, and I wouldn't suggest you hypothesise in your analyses. This is more just for fun, that maybe he will be kind of broken, or that illusion of his power will be somehow kind of diminished.
I was just wondering what you thought the lantern on the light bulb symbolised in the text and in the film, because in the play, Mitch rips it off. And it sort of symbolised like it was reality, like she's finally being seen in reality, her fantasy is now ruined. But then in the movie, Stanley rips it off at the very end. In that last scene, he goes, "Do you want the lantern? You can take it." Rips it off, and she cowers away.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think the lantern, the fact that it's paper, the fact that it's so flimsy, represents this thin veil between the reality and the fantasy, that she needs this, almost the illusion of something hiding the light of the, if you want to look at the light as the truth or the past, or or whatever.
It's almost absurd in the play when she's like, "Don't take the lantern off, you'll see what I really look like," as if we can't already have a proper good look.
And I think there's a tendency for Mitch to say that he actually he's just a dupe and he's a naive guy and actually doesn't know what she's really like. I think he's lying to himself. You know, he's constructing this fantasy. He's willingly allowing her to kind of make claims about her age and her past and so on. And it's also interesting that it's Mitch who puts the lantern up for the first time. So he actually, and again, this is about their relationship, I think, he constructs that fantasy with her and then he sort of tears it off. And I think in the film, he tears it off. And then we have Stanley again at the end. So we have both men ripping it off, refusing to let her have that illusion in the end. And that's the sad thing. And then you could also link that to that song that she sings in the bath about it's only a paper moon. I'm not going to sing it. It's only a paper moon, my dear, just as phony as can be. And this line, it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. And I think that's the kind of key when it gets to this idea of reality and fantasy, that if you have two people who are sharing a fantasy, then isn't there a reality in that? If there's a shared belief, then that could be a shared reality. It doesn't need to necessarily be a fantasy. But so as I sort of suggested before, the problem is that they don't really seem to be sharing the same fantasy or believing in each other the way each other kind of wants them to a certain degree.
More questions? One in the middle, yeah.
What do you think are the main themes of A Streetcar Named Desire, like of the play?
What do you think they are?
I don't know. What do you think?
we could be here all night.
Is there a theme that we've talked about so far that you would like more information on, or interested to hear more about?
Well, she told me love was one, so yeah. Yeah, I'm quite red. Okay, you can just
Just having a conference in the middle
yeah,
of that question.
Yeah, we just want to know I just want to know what like the main themes are.
Okay, look, I'll be honest.
My question.
We do get this question. I get this when I'm doing lectures on this subject, or even other lectures for other films, like On the Waterfront, and we have students. So you're not the first who said, "What are the main themes?" or "What are the main examples?" or "What are the main lines of dialogue that I need to use in my essay?" It doesn't kind of work like that. In a sense, I can sort of tell you sort of things that we've covered. And for me, the things that I find really fascinating about this text are things like the relationship between reality and fantasy, the way the text is structured according to this notion of desire, this repetition or the impossible object, the way it aligns sexuality and death. That, you know, the violence and sexuality seem to kind of go hand in hand for all these kind of characters. You know, we didn't even talk about Blanche and the fact that her lover, or her, you know, what she saw as her sort of sexual partner was living a lie and commits suicide again. So we have sex and death is always intertwined. It's interesting in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of contemporary, at the time, American politics. So there's no one theme that I say this is the truth of this text, and if you understand this theme, then you're guaranteed this mark, or you'll get the big tick. But I think it's about finding what you find fascinating about it, or exploring various aspects of those themes and how the themes are linked. Because I think there's often that sense of one theme, one essay, but I don't think, particularly with this text and complex text like this, you can't really talk about fantasy without actually talking about sexuality or death and so on. There's that lovely sense of layering we get with this play.
Yeah, it's a good summary, really, of A Streetcar Named Desire. Would you please put your hands together and thank Josh Nelson? Cheers.